Hello, I'm Christina Estrada, Regional Sales Manager at Cyberitic. Today we're going to be going over a sales training video on the SkinClear SRVH laser. Dr. Barrows, our Medical Director, will be going over this system more in detail.
Thanks, Christina. I'll be speaking to you today about the SkinClear SRVH neodymium YAG laser. SRVH stands for the indications that are achievable with this device. SRVH means skin rejuvenation, vein and hair removal. All of those modalities are possible with this machine. One of the things I really like about the SRVH is that it has a contact cooling handpiece that's very lightweight. With using the sapphire window, which cools down below freezing, we can keep the skin very, very cool while using high levels of energy to affect these treatments. The device has a number of operating functions that the user can control. One is that we can switch between two different wavelengths, meaning we have both a 1064 nanometer wavelength and a 1320 nanometer wavelength. Not all cosmetic lasers on the market have this capability. The 1320 wavelength is helpful because it is an infrared wavelength that can be used to heat the skin. The reason why we want to heat the skin is actually to cause an injury to the collagen. This causes the collagen to unravel, and it stimulates the proliferation of fibroblasts, which help you develop new skin. The reason this is good is because as you develop fine lines and wrinkles through aging and also sun exposure, we need to have a way to stimulate new collagen to develop to fix this injury. So by inducing a small injury into the dermis, we can actually cause healing that gives us a very nice cosmetic result. The other wavelength, the 1064 wavelength, can be used for a number of treatments, including the elimination of veins as well as unsightly hair. Because each of these targets requires different amounts of energy as well as different times of exposure, we can control that through the device. You couldn't use one of these settings to treat everything. And so part of this training video will take you through some of the features of this machine and show you how that's done. The first thing I'd like to show you on the device itself is the handpiece. One of the reasons why I really like the SRVH device is because it has a very lightweight handpiece. Furthermore, one can control the spot size, which is the amount of distance into which we concentrate the beam, simply by controlling this dial on the handpiece. That automatically transmits this information electronically to the device so that the fluences and other useful parameters are simply indicated on the display without having to program that separately. Also at the end of the device, you can see that the aperture is open. This makes it very easy when you place the device onto the skin to see the visualization of where your beam is going. And if one could feel the sapphire window, this little piece that looks like glass on the end, but which is actually a crystal, you'll know it's icy cold to the touch. This not only helps with protecting the skin against epithelial injury during the treatment, but it also greatly improves the comfort of the procedure. The energy is delivered through a fiber optic cable, this device here. So the actual laser light is created within the box in the optical resonator cavity. This is passed out through a series of mirrors and enters the fiber optic cable, and it travels out to the handpiece. This is also helpful in that it homogenizes the beam so you prevent hot spots. As you look closer at the display itself, you can see there are a number of functions on here. One can see the big number right here, which is called the fluence. If you're not very familiar with lasers, there's a couple of things that you need to know. One is that your customers may ask you how powerful the laser is. That's not exactly the data that you need to know, because one could put a very large engine into a gigantic car and get a different amount of performance than if you put that large engine into a very small car. Obviously, the small car would take off a lot faster, even though it has the same engine as the large car. In a sense, with that anecdote, that's how we use fluence. Fluence calculates basically the amount of energy that's delivered over the entire time of the treatment and into the area of the spot that we've selected. So at this particular setting, I have 45 joules per square centimeter. That means I'm delivering a certain amount of energy into a certain spot size. if I wanted to decrease that amount of energy, I can control that by simply pressing on the display and dialing down that function. Furthermore, you have control over the spot size. As I said, spot size can be controlled directly with the handpiece itself. One thing you might want to do to control spot size is if you're going to do hair treatments, because the hair lives deep down in the tissues, much deeper than, say, a small vessel or other things that we want to treat. I'm going to need to use a very large spot size so that the laser beam can reach deep into the tissues. On the other hand, if I were to treat a small blood vessel, I might need to dial this number down to a smaller spot size so that we can deliver a higher level of total energy into a tiny area that's much more superficial in the skin. The device wouldn't enable me to go to such high fluences with a much larger spot size. If I dial this back out, for example, you can see it automatically forces the fluence down into a smaller number because we're sending that same amount of energy into a larger spot size. Just as pressure is force to area, fluence is energy to area. For ease of use for the customers, rather than have to memorize many different operating parameters for each indication, which vary with skin types, the device is nice in that it keeps a preset collection of treatment protocols. So if, for example, I wanted to treat a coarse hair, I could simply select that. The device knows that if I want to treat a coarse hair, I would need the 1064 nanometer wavelength, and I would need an exposure time of 40 milliseconds for a cumulative fluence of 40 joules per square centimeter. The reason that's relevant is that when you have a very large, thick hair, it absorbs more heat than, say, a small hair. It's just like touching a flagpole. A tiny piece of metal will conduct a little bit of heat away from you, but a large piece of metal will conduct a lot. So if I needed a fine hair, I move down to the next one. You can see we're still using a 1064 wavelength. We're using a little bit more power, but we're doing over a much shorter time period. We don't need as much time to cook a small hair as we do to cook a large hair. So rather than having to remember what was the pulse duration you used for a particular hair size, the device has that programmed for you. Now, on the level of the end user, these are simply starting points. If somebody has a darker skin, for example, we may want to start low and work our way up so to avoid injury. So these are only starting points, and the end user will ultimately manipulate these as is necessary to provide the treatment to the patient. Furthermore, as I move down this screen to show you some of the other functions, in addition to hair, we see there's acne scarring protocols, and then there's what's called the dual lift. The dual lift is a response to try to create what's called the non-surgical facelift. One of the problems has been is that people really have damage from wrinkles and sun exposure, and ultimately the best way to get rid of these things is through very aggressive surgical methods or with CO2 lasers. The problem with that is that both of these have a lot of what we call downtime. It means you can't just go right back out onto the beach or go to the grocery store because there's a lot of injury that occurs to the skin and to the face. The market then has requested that there are devices that work to do similar things but without causing as much injury to the skin. So the dual lift, for example, has several different protocols, and you can see the first one we now have a different number on there. We have a 1320. This is a wavelength also in the infrared. It's a little further into the infrared that causes heating. And what we would do is we would take this patient through several passes on their face, one with the 1320 for heating, and then two with the 1064, one with a very short pulse duration and one with a long pulse duration to try to maximize the combinations of heating the tissue. As we move down on the display, there are many treatments, but I'll just go through a few of them. Another one are the fine facial veins. These are also called telangiectasias. This is when small blood vessels in the face become weakened over time or dilated, and sometimes they can leak in the case of people who suffer from rosacea. You've probably seen people that have little tiny fine red blood vessels and flushing in their cheeks. This is when we would use that particular indication.